listening to the Ag Policy Connection, brought to you by RealAgriculture in partnership with the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. We're connecting the dots between the people and the policies that shape agriculture and farming today and into the future.
Housing versus farmland. How do we balance those two conflicting and competing interests in how land gets used? Welcome to another episode here of the Ag Policy Connection podcast, again brought to you by the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, or CAPI, and RealAgriculture. I'm your host, Kelvin Hepner. Several hundred, if not thousands of acres of some of the most productive prime farmland across Canada are lost every single day, and that's been happening for several decades. If you look at national census data, in Ontario specifically, it's 319 acres per day on average that's been lost over the last couple of decades. And so we're going to investigate the loss of farmland, all the tensions and conflicts around it, and the policies for protecting agricultural land across the country, whether they have succeeded or not, some of what's gotten us to this point, as well as what these policies could look like going forward. I'm looking forward to this discussion with a panel that certainly has a lot of experience on this topic, much more experience than I have. So I'm looking forward to learning about the Agricultural Land Reserve, for example, in British Columbia. In Ontario, we've heard about the Greenbelt in headlines over the last number of years, but we'll dive a bit deeper into that and how those policies and frameworks work. Not only that, though, of course, much of Canada's farmland is outside of those specific areas, those specific case studies or examples. And so we'll talk about different ways that municipal governments, provincial governments, counties can approach the planning process so that farmland is saved for the long term, that long-term interests when it comes to food security, biodiversity, recreation, all those different societal public goods that we've talked about on this season of the Ag Policy Connection, how those can be protected in the medium to long term to leave a better future for, of course, the next generation that's farming and living on this land. So looking forward to hearing from Wayne Caldwell, Professor Emeritus from the University of Guelph. We also have Martin Stradoff. Martin is a returning guest here on the Ag Policy Connection. He's the Executive Director of the Ontario Farmland Trust. And rounding out our panel for this discussion, pleased to welcome Lenore Newman, Director of the Food and Agriculture Institute at the University of Fraser Valley in southern British Columbia. So without further ado, here's our discussion. This latest episode of the Ag Policy Connection is part of CAPI's PLAN initiative for discussing policies for land use, agricultural, and nature. Here we are talking about housing versus farmland, how to balance those two competing interests. All right, bringing in our panelists here on this episode of the Ag Policy Connection as we take a look at this issue of farmland versus housing and what it looks like across the country. First up, we are pleased to welcome Wayne Caldwell, Professor Emeritus at the University of Guelph. Wayne, when we look at the situation in Ontario, of course, there's a lot of attention around that Golden Horseshoe area, the Toronto, Southern Ontario area when it comes to this issue, and a lot of the discussion, I would say, in this country on this topic comes out of Ontario. Can you fill us in on where we're at right now are we making progress at all in slowing the loss of prime farmland in Southern Ontario?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it depends on the time perspective one's looking at. If we look at it over the last 40, 50 years, I would say we've made some reasonable progress. I would say that things have perhaps dipped over the last few years in terms of where we were at relative to where we need to be at. So there's some good news out there, and there's also some disconcerting news. Having said that, I think the current government has backtracked on some of the things that they were proposing, which leaves us a little more optimistic than we might have been even a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm.
Well, we look back in kind of the headlines a few years ago, there was a lot of talk about the Greenbelt and developing the Greenbelt, and some of that was kind of reined in. Martin, what are your thoughts on where things are at in Ontario on this issue and the loss of farmland in Ontario?
Yeah, I mean, we're still waiting to see. Of course, once the new ag census comes out, we'll have the new data, but that's a couple of years away still. from what we've seen, we haven't seen too much of a trend to try to reduce the rate of farmland loss that we're seeing here in the province, but we're certainly some changes from the proposed policies that we saw coming through in the new provincial planning statement. There were some things that I would say were positive, and there were things that are still of concern, and we won't know how that plays out until we start to see those policies be put into effect. So, bit of a mixed
So,
bag.
yeah, what is the number though in terms of acres per day or acres per year that we figure are being lost in Ontario?
So we're losing 319 acres per day, according to the Ag Census. So that's about 4.5, close to 5% over that 5-year time period. So, we're essentially losing a percent of farmland a year, which is very concerning.
Mhm. Lenore, you're of course on the other side of on the West Coast, where the other main market where housing is a major issue, and there's constant discussion about the cost of housing, and of course that puts pressure on land conversion. What are you seeing in BC from your view at the University of Fraser Valley?
Yeah, we're in an odd situation out here in that we have our very solid legal agricultural land reserve that just turned 50. And so our land loss is basically zero right now, which sounds great. So we're not losing farmland, but what we're losing is farms. We're hemorrhaging farms. About 1% of agricultural businesses in BC are disappearing every year. And the odd situation we're in has occurred because those people who know BC know it's a bit of a paradox province in that it's mostly mountains. And so everything's rammed into the valleys, the farmland, the trade enabling lands, the cities, basically everything goes in these little pockets. And what we're seeing, especially after the pandemic, is people realize that, wow, I could sell my house in Vancouver for a large amount of money and buy 5 to 10 acres of farmland out of the city a little bit and live on it, but not farm it. And that is a huge factor. Farmland is real, the cost of farmland is very expensive, and a lot of people are just buying it for estate properties. And we're kind of throwing our hands up because we need to now turn from protecting farmland to protecting farmers, and that's proving to be very difficult.
You mentioned the Ag Land Reserve that just celebrated its 50th anniversary. Can you just at a high level explain how it works for those of us who aren't familiar or don't live in British Columbia?
Yeah, so the land reserve is what's called a quasi-judicial structure in that it's a provincial level land form that is actually even supersedes most provincial government control. So it's land that was set aside to stop sprawl in 1973, and it's very large is the sort of defining feature of it. And um, so here in the Lower Mainland, which, as you mentioned, one of the most expensive places on earth to live, half of the 2,000 square kilometers that we have in the Lower Mainland is set aside in the land reserve. So they drew a very big swath. The and so yeah, it did the job. We were losing farmland extremely rapidly before 1973. Land reserve came in, we stopped losing farmland, so it sounds like a win. That sounds great. But yeah, the flaw is it's always been a bit torn between being a agricultural production area and a green belt because we're supposed to have the ALR and we're supposed to have Greenbelt space, and they're supposed to be separate because they serve different purposes, especially in the modern economy. And because the ALR has kind of had to do both, it's made it a little difficult to farm inside it. There's kind of a public view of farming is very bucolic, think like a red barn and some fruit trees and, probably not like fertilizer spreading and such and, large scale industrial processes. And so that greenbelt role has always been a problem. And it remains true that even though this landform is very well protected, in a way that's caused a problem because it means it's cheaper. So agricultural land runs cheaper than residential land outside the reserve. You get a tax break if you live in the ALR. Even if you don't farm, you pay half the school tax that you would if you were outside. And if you do farm, even minimally, so say you have a couple of sheep or a little patch of blueberries and you manage to make $2,000 a year, your taxes plunge like by about 90%. So what we've seen is a lot of people, now that there's more people maybe only working in the office 2 days a week, they're like, wow, I can have a really great life. I can sell my house for $2 or $3 million. I can buy 10 acres. I can move out. And, and the problem is these people move into farm country. The first thing they start doing is complaining about the industrial farmer next door. So, yeah, we're struggling right now because we preserve the land and it is provincial level. So its municipalities cannot erode the ALR. So it really did its job. It protects farming, but the cost of land is still going up because there's this residential pressure. Odd situation. So we're like a great success story that needs a second act. We need to now figure out how do you make people farm this, because people are starting to ask a question that I'm sad to say is very valid. So we're getting very low utilization rates now in some of the regions. So some of the bedroom communities around Vancouver, only 20% or 30% of the ALR is actually farmed. And people are saying, hey, we're literally dying for lack of housing. We have no industrial land. Why, oh, why are we protecting all of these really nice residential rural properties from development if they're never going to be farmed? And that's the pressure we're running into.
Of course, Wayne, in Ontario, you see that pressure as well. The value of land, the monetary value of land, of course, for development it's difficult for any other use to compete with that, right?
That's true, although I think it's also important to remember the diversity of agriculture across the province. And so much attention is brought to the Greenbelt, appropriately so, surrounding the GTA. But if we think of the diversity going south and east, I mean, down in Essex, Chatham, that part of the province, one of the largest concentrations, if not the largest concentration of greenhouses in North America, as an example. So you get that kind of intense development where you have pressures for housing, but not necessarily the same level of urban pressures. And then you get up into counties like Huron and Perth with the large livestock intensification going on. So I mentioned that just to say that those areas are all outside of the Greenbelt formally, for example, and they have other tools that are used for protection, such as the provincial planning statement that is a statement of provincial values, if you like, that municipalities need to uphold. So I mention that because of that diversity and the concentration and the incredible pressure for housing in the immediate areas in proximity to the GTA. And elsewhere in the province, still pressures for housing, but in some ways, some of the land values are speculation for agricultural purposes as much as they are for housing purposes. So you have this diversity, which I think is really important to recognize and to acknowledge.
When we talk about the Greenbelt, though, can maybe similar to Lenore explaining how the Ag Land Reserve works for those of us who don't live in Ontario, can you fill us in on? We've heard this term often, and I think we understand in broad strokes what it implies. But can you explain at a high level what the Greenbelt is and what the concept is, how it compares?
So I believe it, and Martin can correct me on this if I'm wrong, but if memory serves me right, it's 1.8 million acres around the GTA area, sort of from Northumberland County in the furthest east, all the way around Lake Ontario into Niagara region, and also going as far north up the Bruce Peninsula as well. So it's a large geographic area. And within that, there's an area known as the protected countryside. So you have the urban designations. Toronto is an example. Hamilton is an example. Then you have some what are referred to as white belt lands, lands that don't have a lot of provincial protection, just municipal protection for the most part. And then you have this large area of the protected countryside. And within the protected countryside, it includes agriculture, it includes natural spaces, primarily uses of a rural nature. And those areas are set up with policies from the province, and municipalities need to conform with those policies, and they're legally required to do so. The result of it, similar to the ALR, it was quite effective as a means of curtailing urban expansion and urban designations within those areas. And I would say, notwithstanding a couple of hiccups, it still has been really effective since it came into effect in 2005. So we're looking at a 20-year time period of reasonable success within the protected countryside of the Greenbelt through municipalities enforcing the policies essentially that the province has put out there for them to do.
I might add, Wayne,
Yeah, go ahead.
1.8 million acres, 750,000 of those acres are farmland. So there's quite a substantial amount. So to Lenore's point earlier, there is this complexity around, okay, purpose of the Greenbelt, but farming is such a critical component of the activities that take place in the Greenbelt. And it's something that is often promoted about farming being such an economic powerhouse within the Greenbelt. So they've really tried to merge those two concepts together.
Has that number of acres been more stable inside the Greenbelt than outside of it, Martin?
Relatively stable. Yep.
Okay.
I'll just mention we did research actually where we targeted and looked at official plan amendments, which are the tool by which a land use change occurs over the period from 2005 through to, I think the last for data was 2019, and a colleague at Guelph is still looking at that data. And within the protected countryside, the answer was essentially zero in terms of land loss to new amendments that municipalities would have approved. Now, that has changed a little bit. As you'll be aware, the current government proposed some movement changes in those boundaries and then in turn backed off them. So within it, it's been pretty effective within the Greenbelt itself.
Lenore, you mentioned the need to evolve, or potentially mentioned, I think you implied that there's increasing pressure that the Ag Land Reserve as a concept needs to evolve to kind of a next phase. As we look at both the Greenbelt example in Ontario and the Land Reserve in BC and across the country, provincial different levels of government have different mechanisms for directing how land is used and conserving land, which we're talking about on this podcast series. What do you see as next steps or potential scenarios that where government could be headed in terms of the land reserve in BC?
Well, I think it's a complicated question, and rule changes have to be approached really carefully. But that said, I think number one, and the sort of low-hanging fruit, we know we're losing farmers rapidly. We know in particular we're losing processing, which then you lose the farmers that were feeding the processors. And so number one, we have to reform all of the red tape around doing these activities in the ALR. So farmers have told us loud and clear, BC is a really hard place to farm. So there's just so many levels of red tape and government control and weird rules that have accumulated over 50 years. And so we need a really tight cleanup to make it easy to farm and easy to process in the ALR, even if that, and I mean, so a great example, is when I think of, say, Leamington, I think of greenhouse. Building a greenhouse in the ALR right now is a vale of tears because there's literally red tape on every single step of the process. And we really are struggling with that, making it so farmers can come in, grow, have a place to send their food. We've also had the problem that because Alberta does not have an ALR, they've been heavily recruiting our processing business, our advanced agriculture, so think controlled environment and greenhouse, and they're saying, hey, come here. You won't have to deal with all this weird red tape. So that's my number one. Every day is just saying, please, please make it easy for farmers and hard for not non-farmers in the ALR. Now, we have had the municipalities saying, well, maybe we need some sort of empty farms tax, but it's a bit of a non-starter when you have so much of the ALR not being used for farming. Like politically, it's hard to imagine having a have to farm rule on the ALR. Now, there are countries that do that. Japan, for example, you have to farm farmland. You can't buy it and live on it. But I think that ship has sailed. It would have been great to have at the outset. But, I look at, say, some of the North Valley municipalities where only 20% of the ALR is used. We have literally thousands of acres of residential where if you slapped a giant tax on, there'd probably be a revolt of some sort. So I think low-hanging fruit, help farmers farm, help processors process, realize also that farming is changing. So a controlled environment structure is a farm, a greenhouse is a farm. We need to really make it easier for business to operate in this space.
If I'm a politician in BC, though, Lenore, and maybe this is my prairie Western Canadian perspective here, where we have lots of land and we don't often think about food security, I would say. If I'm a politician in BC, what's stopping me from, for political reasons, talking about opening up the agricultural land reserve because of housing costs and because of the immense pressure that there is? Why does it matter if we have local food production in British Columbia? Is that something that is politically popular?
Yeah, it's interesting because it has always been a sacred cow because the reserve is fanatically popular with the public. However, as word gets out that it's not actually being farmed, those trial balloons are starting to float. And that is my big worry, there is a use it or lose it mentality. Because truth is, we have very little land in BC, and we have the most expensive housing on earth, pretty well, in the Lower Mainland. And yeah, some of these municipalities are starting to look at that empty farmland and go like, oh, could we not dip in? Now, the problem is I am very against dipping into the ALR for housing for the simple reason we could swallow it in 10 years. Like if we opened up the ALR in the Lower Mainland for housing, 10 years later would be exactly where we are now, just with no farmland. Because we're not talking about a lot of land. We're talking about 1,000 square kilometers that's protected, which it sounds big until you think that, well, the GTA is 7,000 or 8,000 square kilometers of sprawl. And so for Vancouver to double in size wouldn't take very long, and it would totally destroy our best farmland. So yeah, I think that the political argument is getting weaker, and we see that elsewhere. We saw that happen in Korea, where South Korea dissolved their agricultural land reserve largely, partly for the same housing pressure. We're also seeing it in London, where for 60 years, the London Greenbelt was sacred. It was sacred. It was wind in the willows country. And now we're seeing it being raided for housing. If we can't get farmers onto agricultural land, we will see housing come in eventually. And I don't think that's a good outcome for us because we're in a situation where BC already experiences empty shelves sometimes because so much of our supply comes from California. There are so often now disruptions in that chain. We have to be looking to produce more of our food domestically for a national security reason. And all over the world, countries are realizing that global trade peaked in 2008. We are seeing rapid deglobalization around the world as countries become more insular. We want to make sure we have food in British Columbia. So yeah, we need to grow. And it's a big worry. It keeps me up at night that will someone will wake up one day and say, "Oh, I can get a quick win on housing," but you only get it once.
Martin, that's very tempting, and we've of course seen the PC government in Ontario and probably other political parties as well. But that's the recent example of certainly housing costs are something that if you can do something about that, that's popular politics, especially in the short term.
Yeah, certainly. And one thing that I often try to bring into the conversation is, yes, we need housing. Housing and housing affordability is a serious issue in this province, and a lot of different places across the country. But if we are replacing our farmland with housing, we've really just replaced one issue with another. So we've now addressed the issue of housing, but now where's our food coming from? And when we think about, I'm really glad Lenore brought in the example of, the food supply chain that's coming in from the US. The US is losing 2 million acres of farmland a year. And so when we think about where's our food going to come from, and we're seeing very American first policies and an American first president coming in, that is very risky for us Canadians that rely so heavily on our food coming in from the US. And so we can't just replace one of these problems that is, addressing a basic societal need such as housing and getting rid of our farmland in order to do that. We've just replaced problems. We haven't gotten any farther ahead, and we need to come up with solutions that are going to address both issues.
So, do voters in Ontario care enough that political decision makers, municipal level, provincial level, are seeing that vision in the long term?
I think when we saw what happened with the Greenbelt controversy, how many Ontarians, not just those in and around the Greenbelt, but across the province, Lenore talked about the sacred cow that was the ALR. I think that's very similar for people of Ontario with the Greenbelt. And because the government backed off of their plans to open up significant portions of the Greenbelt, I would say, yes, voters do care about that. So they satiated that concern by backing off of their plans to open up the Greenbelt for development. But we still have a very pro-development government right now. So what's to come in the future, and maybe we'll see what happens with certainly upcoming elections, but we're not really too sure on what they might trigger between now and then, given the reaction that the public did have.
Mm-hmm. The land reserve in BC and the Greenbelt are both excellent case studies, I think, and examples for us to learn from and to examine. But the majority of farmland across Canada, Wayne, is not inside of these legal frameworks. What are some examples, or what do you see as maybe success stories of finding a system that works for all players outside of these specific examples in BC and Ontario? Of course, the fringe areas, farmland around every urban center in Canada is under pressure for development.
Absolutely. And, I think we have situations where much of this is left to municipalities, and you tend to get a fractured response across the country. And even I think in Ontario as an example, where municipalities will interpret some of the policies a little bit different from their neighboring municipality. And as a result, you get different kinds of outcomes. Even in Alberta, as I understand it, and I've spent a bit of time in the province speaking to people, as you have policies at a municipal level, and folks do their best. But without that support from their province, it becomes tricky. We can certainly look at Quebec, where they've got their own legislation that I understand has been quite effective over the generations now. And we continue to, look for what we can do. I was recently speaking to folks in Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island, and they're challenged as well with trying to find what are the right outcomes, what are the right approaches, and how do we protect the land that's so important. And I think part of it comes from, and I think why and I'd be interested in Martin's take on this too, why we've seen some positive outcomes in Ontario over the last 25 years is the buy-in from our provincial farm organizations. And I can remember early in my career, for example, the Federation of Agriculture was the largest general farm organization, struggling with their own policy. And now it's quite evident that they're all about protecting farmland, making sure that we, put farmland on the top of the pedestal in terms of agricultural areas to protect it. And I give credit to the farm leaders and the farm organizations for helping to make that happen. And I think as well, there are other pieces to this puzzle too. And I know we're not focused on climate change today, but what that means for the agricultural land that we have, and we referred to what was happening in the US, not only is it land being lost, but we think of how much production comes out of California, and we think of the water challenges and shortages that they face. And what does that mean over time to our food supply? And I reflect on, there's a map I often like to look at, which is a global map forecasting agricultural productivity out to 2080 thereabouts, and where productivity will be lost and where some productivity will be gained. And the parts of southern Canada are likely to see some increase in productivity, at least in some areas which have that water supply, notwithstanding the uncertainty that might occur. But it simply means that at a global level, the land that we have, as valuable as it is, becomes even more valuable, and all the more reason to protect it in the generations ahead. And I think it's really important to bring that into the discussion, into the debate, to recognize that if you're sitting on quality farmland, whether it's in Ontario or whether it's in Newfoundland for that matter, it's all the more reason to celebrate it and protect it.
Mm. And you also raise a point, or triggered a thought here. We talked about acres being lost earlier. We didn't talk about productivity capacity or ability, or quality of acres that are being lost as well, or how that equation is changing as well.
That's absolutely true. And, we have soils are rated for their agricultural productivity across the country, or capacity from a scale of 1 to 7. And we look at where things are concentrated. The lower Fraser Valley, the high quality land that's there, southern Ontario with the vast, large proportion of the top best agricultural land in the country. And it's all the more reason to bring focus to that rating system and to protect those best lands, because you can't substitute class 1 farmland with class 5 farmland and expect the same outcomes over the long term.
Yeah.
No matter how much fertilizer you add to it.
Oh, exactly. And like you said, water availability, there's many different characteristics and ways of measuring and the factors that go into that productivity equation. Martin, one of the things we've been exploring on this podcast series is the economics of land use decisions, how landowners choose how land gets used. And there are options available, whether we're talking conservation easements, there are ecological goods and services type programs, there are different incentives for signaling to landowners to use land in certain ways. But I'm not sure we've come up with any that really compete with the monetary value of development and the potential value of land using it for that purpose. So does that mean we need legal frameworks like the Greenbelt and the Agricultural Land Reserve to ultimately protect land, or can the market offer incentives to keep land in farming or in conservation purposes?
Well, it's tricky because I'd say we don't have a market yet that allows for that. And I don't know if there's a perfect model yet either. There are some programs down in the US where you do see conservation easements they're paying for the development rights. So that's offsetting what they might be able to do with the payment. We don't have that kind of access to funding to be able to offset those kinds of and compete with the deep pockets of developers for sure. But we're also, I don't think, ever really going to be able to properly value what the land is through a monetary value. And so that's really tricky, right? There's a lot that comes with the impacts of if we're undermining our food security or environmental health or even our cultural heritage, right? That is all intertwined in farmland. And of course, once that's gone, it's not going to come back into production. And so having that kind of opportunity loss from a multi-generational perspective is very difficult to calculate. And so, there's this this element of our society needs to be able to produce food to feed its population. And we know that this is the land that's able to do that. We need to be able to protect it. I think that also we need to ensure that, farmers are having viable livelihoods off from their farm business, right? And being able to make a living and being able to look at a piece of farmland and say, I can make a living off of that. But what we're also seeing right now is that the next generation isn't able to buy farmland because of the fair market value that we see it on the market for. So that's creating a whole nother challenge that I think is also getting to what Lenore was talking about in the ALR, in the sense that how is the next generation ever going to be able to get access to land to farm it if those with deep pockets that don't have an interest in farming are the ones that are able to actually buy and afford the land. So there are a lot of different types of tax incentive programs. We can enhance a few of the ones that we currently have as well to try to make sure that there are conservation protection measures that are put in place so it remains in food production. But it's a really complex challenge to try to address.
Lenore, even
thoughts, right?
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Lenore, any thoughts?
Yeah, well, in BC, it's such an extreme example. It's where if the ALR didn't exist, the land would be housing. And because and you look at the sort of hierarchy, if I go to a place like Richmond next to Vancouver, ALR land in Richmond can run $200,000, $300,000 an acre. Industrial land runs as high as 4 or 5 million per acre. And if it's residential, you're looking at 10 million per acre. So there is no market scenario in which you maintain any use other than dense housing. So if you want anything else, including industrial, you literally have to zone it into place and then hold the line. So it's really tricky. And we are definitely seeing the same thing. We're seeing existing farmers whose kids look at the business and they're like, I can't do this. I can't make money. It makes no sense. How do I buy into this, even if they already have the land? And so that is the big question. And so, one of the things we've really focused on at University of Fraser Valley is looking at, okay, how do you maximize farm gate per acre on our very weird, intense land? Because it's great soil, but maybe you want to look at, okay, I've got a corner that isn't such great soil. How do I get a greenhouse on it? How do I put up some sort of like farm gate value add business? We've spent a lot of time looking at the Netherlands because it is a little bit of a similar situation where the land base is really constrained. And so they've maximized farm gate per acre as much as possible. And I think what I tend to come out of this is there's no one size fits all solution. Because if I'm in Alberta, it's great. I don't need an ALR. I mean, they produce commodities on the large scale and they have a great ag industry. They don't have to worry about preserving every single acre and maximizing value on it. They need to think about growing an industry. And we have a very different problem. So yeah, it's a challenge. We definitely need the designation, but we also need to then say, okay, how do we make it so people can make a living running a farm business? Because at the end of the day, farming is not a hobby. Or if it is a hobby, people don't stick at it very long because it's a very hard hobby. It has to be a business or it won't exist.
Wayne, how do decision makers, the people that are setting these planning laws and bylaws and putting stuff in effect, where the rubber actually hits the road, how do they balance all these interests? Of course, if you're a municipal councillor or representing a county, you want jobs in your jurisdiction, you want economic activity, tax revenue, all of that. How do you balance that with the future value of food security and biodiversity and all those other societal public goods?
Yeah, I think that word that you just used, balance, is really the key question. And how do we achieve that balance, right? How do we get there? I mean, I can look out my window here and I see quality farmland, but just down the road there's a large aggregate operation as an example, and a little village with pressures for urban expansion happening there. And how do you balance and bring all of those things together? And I mean, in planning, we use this term, the public good. And, it's about also, I think, thinking not just about today, but the next generation, 10, 20, 30 years from now, and how do we make sure that those folks have at least what we have in terms of their ability to make sure that they have a functioning society. And no matter how you slice that as a country, in my view, food production always needs to be in that equation, right? So yes, and as Martin acknowledged earlier, we have this need for housing. And I've just done some work with the Greenbelt Foundation, for example, looking at what are some of the housing options. How do we make sure that they're accommodated, both in terms of urban expansion and higher intensification, but also on farms themselves, right? For farm workers and farm labor. I was just talking to a farmer yesterday who has 36 employees, 36 or 32 employees on his farm, and running into issues with the municipality in terms of getting housing approval for those folks because coming in internationally, it's difficult to accommodate them in the urban centers and have that work. So most farmers want to see that housing on the farms themselves. So you do have needs for housing on farms. It's just, in my view, to make sure that we don't, dare use the term, throw the baby out with the bathwater. And that chunk of importance is making sure that we have agricultural capacity and agricultural productivity. Lenore has reminded us on at least a couple of occasions how important it is that these farms be prosperous, right? And are our policies there to accommodate that and allow for the diversification, provide the flexibility that's required, without weakening things to the point that you end up losing the value of what you've got, which again is those agricultural resources, that agricultural productivity, that agricultural land.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's well, I guess it's a wicked problem. That's what we call these things, right?
It is, and I think what we look for, what we aim for, hope for, is this notion of stability on the farm, right? And that's one thing I think we've suffered from in Ontario over the last number of years, is that the policies have been sort of topsy-turvy and uncertain. Whereas what the Greenbelt attempted to do, going back to 2005, was to bring in more predictability on the stability of what was going on there so that farmers could make the investments that they need to make, whether it be in livestock or greenhouses or market gardening, whatever their own approach might be, that they have some stability knowing that, okay, I'm not going to run the risk of my neighbor being converted from an agricultural use to a condominium, as an example, but rather could look to that productivity and make those investments with some certainty. Now, that creates this dilemma because people will realize that in some ways their land value has been impacted by those decisions. But at the same time, if we have prosperous farm operations and prosperous farm activity, then it's much easier for folks to accept that because they have a strong value and belief in the agricultural sector. And for many people, these are intergenerational farms that they want to see remain in farming, if not within the family itself.
Mm-hmm. Wayne, with your planning background, I have a question specifically for you. From our farm perspective, we often think, well, it's easier. Cities can just build higher. They can build skyscrapers and urban densification. Why don't we just make cities stay within their boundaries and go become more dense? But then at the same time, we have politicians talking about the Canadian dream, where every family has their single family home that they live in. How do planners address that issue of people still having this idea of not living in these massive apartment complexes?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think most people would say, politically and at a planning level as well, is that it's important to have a diversity of housing, that people at different stages of their life will look for different kinds of things. And people with families might not necessarily be as happy in apartments or condominiums. Notwithstanding, around the world, people often raise families in apartments and condominiums. But in the Canadian context, look for that diversity. And I think, we can build high quality, denser communities. And I think that's what we aim to do. When I drive into Toronto, when I see skyscrapers and large apartment buildings being built, I'm thinking there's a win for farmland, right? Because we have increased that density in that location, and it can occur. And if we think of the places around the world that we might want to visit, visiting urban centers. I mean, isn't downtown Vancouver fantastic for a visitor? I mean, it's these high density places that have all of these services that contribute to quality of life. Notwithstanding, in rural communities, you may be looking for something different. So I think it's about, again, it comes back to that word balance and making sure that we make thoughtful, wise decisions, and that transit density are obvious goals in the planning system. And, if we think of the millions of people forecast to move to Ontario in the next couple of decades or so, there will be continued pressure on housing, and there will be some, dare I say, I was going to say some loss of farmland. Notwithstanding, I think there's all kinds of opportunity for infill within those urban centers to accommodate that growth.
Martin, go ahead.
I also think that we need to challenge that notion that the dream is that everybody has this single family home. I don't think that overall that's the dream for a lot of people coming up in the next generation of homeowners. They do want to live in multifamily units where they either are with their family or friends. And we've experienced now what it's like to have to commute for an hour on a congested highway, twice a day. And people don't want to go back to that after they had experienced being, home during the pandemic. They're like, oh, wow, I don't have to spend this kind of time on the highway to drive from my single family home into my place of work. And we're starting to see people starting to realize, well, when I live closer to my friends and my family, I have a higher quality of life. When I'm living closer to where I work, I have more time because I'm home sooner at the end of the day. And so I think that notion of what that dream is starting to be challenged by that next generation. And I'm hoping that that starts to push some change in how we start to think about the design of our communities.
If I might, just to reiterate that point, Martin, I think it's a really good one. And as a specific example, and this is back to single family, but it's a different variety. So I had a former student share with me a map, and it had an area on the perimeter that was developed in the 1970s. And these were lots which were 1 to 2 acres in size, low density. And then he showed the infill development, large infill development that occurred after the Greenbelt came into place in the Places to Grow document in Ontario that increased the density. And in the same space that you had one lot in the 1970s, you were probably in that neighborhood of 20 parcels in the 2005 plus time frame. And it just goes to show, even for people that do continue, Martin, to have that same dream of a single family dwelling, you can do it in a very different way than was done historically, and some good outcomes, in addition to the apartments, the condominiums, and so on that can be there to facilitate that need for housing.
Yeah, I think
it's interesting 'cause of course I'm sitting in East Vancouver today, and I really enjoy the lifestyle here because of that. I like being able to walk and etc. And we're already kind of living that, and I kind of agree. Like the Canadian dream here, it's long gone. I mean, it's single family housing isn't even an allowed zoning in Vancouver anymore. Um, if you buy a single family house in this neighborhood, it's $3 million, and it's probably not single family. You will have a basement suite that you rent out. You will have a coach house that you rent out. So you're kind of a landlord automatically. It's like you built bought a little apartment building with a pointy roof. What we do need to get better at here, and we're still trying to learn, it's not easy if you have a family because we don't build the right sort of apartments. It's not like in Paris or Milan where you can get a 3-bedroom flat and it's like, 1,400 square feet and it's gorgeous. We're still figuring that out. But I think we do need to go down that road, at least in Vancouver, because the truth is we're surrounded by mountains and ocean, and even liquidating the ALR doesn't buy us much extra land. We either need to figure out how to live densely and enjoy it, or build some more cities somewhere else, which no one seems to have a stomach to do in Canada anymore. because it's very expensive. So yeah, we're if you want to see the future, you can come here. And the only flaw is it's really you pay really a lot. And that's something we need to get a handle on is how do we make this form of housing a little cheaper?
Hmm. Wayne, you made the comment that as farmers we should see a new skyscraper being built as a success story, and that is a perspective that I haven't thought of before. I've often thought the reverse, where people living in cities should appreciate the intensification and efficiency of modern agriculture, of the scale that we've achieved, and how that's freed up resources for the rest of society. But the vice versa scenario applies in this as well. That's good perspective.
Yeah, it's true. I think, that growth will happen, but let's make sure we make wise decisions and minimize the impact on agriculture.
Mhm. Okay, final quick around the horn here. As we look to the future, what do you think we need to see more of when it comes to policy decisions, the direction that decision makers need to be taking to preserve and reduce this loss of productive farmland across the country? I know maybe this is too easy a question, but maybe if you have realistic or tangible policy decisions that you think provincial, municipal decision makers should be moving in towards in terms of direction. Martin, I'll put you on the spot, let you go first in terms of what you'd like to see going forward.
Sure. I'd like to see some hard urban boundary lines in a number of municipalities across the province. We are seeing, I mean, for example, we saw that with Waterloo. They had great success with their urban boundary that really prevented the sprawl of that city when it was expanding at quite a substantial rate. And now when we're looking at our fastest growing cities in Ontario, we're seeing Toronto, of course, no surprise there, but London. And the population density of London is less than half of what that is in Toronto. So if we can create that hard urban boundary line in this part of the province that is, if they're sprawling on prime farmland, creating that hard urban boundary line really and reinforcing that we need to be upping the urban density of those cities. But with that, and again, tribute to Waterloo, it wasn't just about here's a hard urban boundary line. It had to do with the transit system that they were investing in and a lot of the other resources that are needed in order to have livable communities and these 15-minute sort of community concept. And so it wasn't just one policy, it was these multiple policies that would be making denser living in Waterloo more livable for everybody.
Lenore, if you had the option of making a decision, a genie that controlled a politician's decision in British Columbia, what would that wish be?
Yeah, our next step is to let farmers farm, to make it simple. We saved the land, thumbs up, yay. Now let's make it so the easiest use of that land is farming. So that means cutting red tape, getting the municipalities out of the way where they're interfering with farming, and just making sure farmers have everything they need to build economically viable businesses that conceivably they could pass on to another generation of farmers, because that's our next challenge here.
All right. Wayne, final thoughts to you.
Yeah, I agree with the comments made by both Martin and Lenore, but let me take a slightly different tack, which is more the process side of things, which is more discussion and understanding about agriculture. We've done a number of studies looking at capacity that municipalities have to deal with agricultural issues, and many municipalities are lacking people that are responsible for making the decisions that impact agriculture. And it comes back to the point Lenore just made: municipalities to get out of the way. And I think the way you get out of the way is you understand what you're dealing with. And unfortunately, we don't always have those kinds of resources at a municipal level that understand and to make those kinds of decisions. I think it comes from speaking to each other, comes from communication, it comes from that integration of ideas from an agricultural perspective.
All right. Amen. Thank you, all three of you, Martin, Lenore, Wayne. Thanks for taking the time to join us here on the Ag Policy Connection and discuss this important topic.
So thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, certainly lots to consider and think about when it comes to steps that need to be taken to preserve farmland for the long term as we talk about that housing versus farmland debate here on this episode of the Ag Policy Connection. Thanks again to Wayne Caldwell, Professor Emeritus at the University of Guelph, Martin Stradoff with the Ontario Farmland Trust, and Lenore Newman at the University of Fraser Valley in BC. I should note, Lenore's written several books. The most recent one, I believe, was called Dinner on Mars, and from what I understand, she's working on a new book as well. So stay tuned, hoping to reconnect with her in the coming months as that book becomes available publicly as she works on that. So thanks to all three of them again for joining us for this discussion. Certainly good to learn more about the Agricultural Land Reserve and the Greenbelt in Ontario, both specific examples and case studies that I think we can learn a lot from when it comes to whether they worked, how they were successful, but also some of the unintended consequences or the next level effects that now need to be dealt with because of these stringent policies that certainly I think we can learn from. And as we discussed, there's pressures facing farmland across the country. Wherever there is urban expansion happening, there's this pressure for conversion of productive farmland into housing, and certainly lots to think about when it comes to how those policies are shaped going forward. So looking forward to our next episode of the Ag Policy Connection, hoping to get that out here in the next week or two. It's going to be about who gets to decide how land gets used. Conservation, should it be for development, housing, such as what we talked about today, or for farming purposes? What type of farming is also part of that? We're going to bring in some people from, I think we could say, who are working on the front lines of this issue. So looking forward to that discussion. I should also note we're hoping to establish a separate podcast feed for the Ag Policy Connection podcast in your podcast player, wherever you listen, whether it's on realagriculture.com or in Apple Music, Spotify, all the different podcast apps, hoping to get a separate channel going here. Of course, right now you can listen as part of the Real Agriculture podcast feed, the main fire hose as we call it, but hoping to break it out as well. So if you have any questions, comments on something that we discussed on today's episode, if the discussion triggered any thoughts, certainly welcome your opinions and feedback all the time. My email address is khepner@realagriculture.com. On behalf of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute and Real Agriculture, thanks for joining us for this latest episode of the Ag Policy Connection. And until next time, take care.